Hey guys, tonight, you probably wouldn't survive this. Not because it's dangerous, exactly, but because your phone battery would panic. Your calendar would feel irrelevant, and your sense of urgency would be gently but firmly escorted out of the village. Time works differently here. It stretches, it listens. It waits for everyone to sit down before it continues. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, go ahead and drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. Night has many accents, and it's nice to know how far it's traveled to find you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The sky above you is shifting colors slowly, like it's not in any rush to decide on darkness. Faded orange gives way to purples that feel worn in, familiar, the way old fabric feels softer than new. This is the hour when work ends without ceremony. Tools are set down. Feet are washed. Someone laughs nearby, the sound brief and low, like laughter that doesn't want to wake the ancestors. This region, West Africa's broad Sahelian belt, has known evenings like this for thousands of years. That part is not poetic exaggeration. It's a widely accepted historical fact that long before written records dominated historical memory, societies here preserved lineage, law, and ethics through spoken word and song. Memory was not outsourced to paper. It lived in people, which, frankly, puts a lot of pressure on remembering birthdays. As the heat loosens its grip, you notice how sound takes over where sight retreats. The rhythm of footsteps, the soft knock of wood against wood as someone adjusts a stool, the low testing hum of a stringed instrument, just a note or two, not a performance yet. It's like the village itself is clearing its throat. You are gently guided to sit. Not directed, just. It becomes obvious that sitting is what happens next. You fold yourself onto the earth or a woven mat, realizing immediately that this ground has hosted generations of the same movement. Knees bend, backs settle. No one rushes. No one asks what time it is. Somewhere, a child fidgets and is gently corrected with a look that says, "History is about to start. Please contain your limbs." This is dusk's real purpose, not just the absence of sun, but the invitation to remember. In many West African cultures, evenings were traditionally the time for communal storytelling, especially during the dry season when agricultural labor slowed. The night air made listening easier. Fires kept away insects and distractions. Griots, professional oral historians, would step into this shared silence and do something quietly miraculous. Recite centuries without notes. No teleprompter. No sorry, let me start that again. And here's a lesser-known detail that tends to surprise people. Griots didn't just memorize stories. They memorized people. Entire family genealogies, praise names, marriages, conflicts, reconciliations stored and updated like a living archive with opinions. You couldn't just rewrite history because you felt like it. Someone in the circle would cough politely, and suddenly your great-grandfather's questionable decision was back in the story. Historians still wonder if this oral precision rivaled written records in accuracy, or if memories subtly reshaped facts over generations to better serve social harmony. Was it history, or was it therapy? Possibly both. Possibly better. The fire brightens slightly as night deepens, throwing soft light onto faces now relaxed, expectant. You realize no one is scrolling. No one is multitasking. Listening here is a full-body activity. Even your breathing begins to sync with the cadence of the moment, slowing down like it's been waiting all day to do this. A breeze passes through, carrying the smell of dust, smoke, and something faintly sweet, maybe millet porridge, cooling somewhere behind you. Your modern instincts tell you this is the part where someone starts, but that's not how it works. Stories here don't begin abruptly. They arrive gradually, like sleep. You shift your weight, and the ground accepts the adjustment without complaint. A distant drum sounds once not a signal, more like a reminder. Another follows, softer. The rhythm is unhurried, deliberately unremarkable. No dramatic build-up. Just a steady pulse saying, we've done this before. There's a subtle humor in how seriously everyone takes this. The idea that memory deserves ceremony, that stories deserve time. It's almost funny how radical that feels now. You imagine trying to explain this pacing to your email inbox. It would not take it well. The sky finally settles into darkness, stars appearing not all at once, but as if someone is slowly turning up a dimmer switch. Out here, away from city glare, the stars don't sparkle, they observe. You get the impression they've heard these stories already. Another accepted fact floats quietly into your awareness. Griots, often held, respected, sometimes feared positions in society. Their words could praise, but they could also shame. Memory is power when everyone agrees to listen. Which might explain why the tone tonight feels gentle but alert. Even relaxation here has posture. Someone clears their throat not loudly, just enough to signal readiness. You don't know their name yet, but you will. The fire pops. A child finally stills. Your shoulders drop another inch. And without anyone announcing it, the night crosses a threshold. You feel it not as excitement, but as a soft internal click, like a door closing somewhere behind you. The day is over. The remembering can begin. The person beside the fire doesn't stand up the way you expect someone important to stand up. There's no dramatic rise, no clearing of space, no grand posture adjustment. They simply shift forward, like a thought leaning closer. You realize this is intentional. Authority here doesn't need volume. It has gravity. This is the griot. They sit comfortably, as if they've been sitting like this their entire life. Which, historically speaking, they probably have. In many West African societies, the role of griot is hereditary, passed down through families for centuries. That's a widely accepted historical fact, and it means storytelling here isn't a hobby or a phase. It's a lineage. Somewhere in this person's memory are the voices of parents, grandparents, teachers, all stacked neatly like well-used books that never sit on shelves. You notice the griot's eyes first. Calm, observant, slightly amused, like someone who knows something about you but is polite enough not to bring it up. They glance around the circle, making eye contact without holding it too long, as if checking that everyone's settled into the same rhythm. When their gaze passes over you, it lingers just enough to feel intentional. Congratulations, you've been acknowledged by history. They speak, finally, but softly. Not to command, attention has already arrived, but to invite it to stay. The voice is warm, textured, carrying the faint rasp of smoke and years. It's the kind of voice that doesn't rush, because it doesn't need to. You find yourself leaning in slightly, which is interesting, because no one asked you to. The griot begins, not with a story, but with a comment. Something dry. A small joke about the heat, or the stubbornness of goats, or the way people claim to remember things until asked to repeat them. A ripple of quiet laughter moves through the group. This is deliberate. Humor loosens the room. It reminds everyone that memory, while sacred, doesn't have to be stiff. Here's a lesser-known detail that often gets overlooked. Griots were not only historians, but also diplomats, advisors, and sometimes mediators in disputes. Their knowledge of family histories made them uniquely qualified to say things like, "Now, let's all remember how this went last time," which is an incredibly effective way to calm people down. You can feel that authority even now, resting comfortably beneath the humor. The griot adjusts their seat close enough to the fire that the light outlines their hands. Those hands have a particular stillness to them, not tense, not idle. Ready, you realize they are about to hold more than gestures. They're about to hold centuries. They introduce themselves in a way that feels less like a name and more like a position. The words are rhythmic, practiced, familiar to the ears around you. You catch phrases that sound like praise, names, descriptive titles that reference ancestors, achievements, quirks. Praise names are a documented feature of many West African oral traditions, and they serve as both honor and reminder. You are who you come from. No pressure. The griot pauses, letting the name settle into the air like dust after footsteps. Silence here isn't awkward. It's productive. You're starting to notice how often the griot uses pauses, not as breaks, but as punctuation. They allow the story to breathe before it's even told. They glance at the fire, then back at the circle. You listen well, they say not to you specifically, but somehow it lands on you anyway. It feels less like a compliment and more like an observation. Listening, you're learning, is considered a skill. One you are currently auditioning for. Another soft joke follows, something about people who don't listen and later complain that history surprises them. A few heads nod, you suppress a smile. It feels uncomfortably relevant. Historians still wonder exactly how griots maintained such consistency over generations without written texts. Some argue that musical structure, melody, rhythm, repetition acted as a mnemonic device, locking facts into patterns that resisted change. Others suggest that the flexibility of oral tradition allowed for subtle adaptation, ensuring relevance without losing core truth. Standing or rather sitting here, it's hard to imagine this knowledge slipping away easily. It feels anchored. The griot begins to tune the instrument beside them, not yet playing, just testing. A light pluck, a soft hum. The sound barely travels beyond the firelight, and yet it seems to rearrange the air. You feel your shoulders drop again, your breathing slow, as if your body recognizes this frequency from somewhere older than thought. They speak again, this time more deliberately, framing the evening. Not an introduction, not a summary, more like setting a bowl on the table. These stories, they say, are not mine. A pause, I carry them. Another pause. Tonight, so do you. You resist the urge to look around and see if anyone else just felt that small internal shift. Everyone did. No one reacts. This shared responsibility is important. In many griot traditions, the audience is not passive. Listening is participation. Memory survives because it is distributed, which is both beautiful and, frankly, exhausting. You suddenly understand why everyone here seems so attentive. Forgetting is not a private failure. It's communal. The fire crackles louder for a moment, as if agreeing. The griot smiles faintly, like they've noticed the timing but won't comment on it. They're not showy, they don't need to be. Their confidence comes from knowing that when they speak, people remember. That's a level of influence most modern platforms would envy. They lean back slightly, letting the anticipation stretch. Somewhere behind you, an owl calls. The sound blends into the night without interruption. No one checks the time. No one needs to. The griot looks at you again, just briefly. There's a sense, not uncomfortable, just curious that you are being measured, not for knowledge, but for openness. Can you carry something gently? Can you let it change you without trying to own it? You realize, with a small internal laugh, that this is where you'd usually reach for a notebook, or at least mentally bookmark a few facts. But there's nothing to write with here. Nothing to capture, only something to absorb. The griot inhales slowly. The instrument is ready now. The circle is quiet in that particular way that means no one is forcing it. And you understand that whatever comes next won't feel like being told something. It will feel like being trusted. The griot's fingers finally settle onto the strings, and for a moment nothing happens. Not silence, there's never silence, but intention. You notice how everyone's posture shifts just slightly, as if their bodies recognize what their minds don't yet articulate. This is the kora, and it doesn't announce itself. It waits for you to arrive. Then the first notes appear, light and deliberate, like footsteps testing a bridge. The sound is softer than you expect, more intimate than impressive. It doesn't fill the night. It threads through it. Each string plucked sends a small ripple through the air, and you feel it land somewhere behind your eyes, loosening thoughts that have been clinging too tightly all day. The kora, a 21-stringed instrument traditionally associated with griots of the manned world, is a historical fact wrapped in elegance. It's been played for centuries, passed down alongside stories, its construction refined but never rushed. The calabash body rests against the griot's legs, grounded, while the long neck rises like a quiet question mark. You find yourself wondering how many hands have held instruments like this before yours ever learned to type. The griot doesn't look at their hands while playing. They don't need to. The patterns are familiar enough to live in muscle memory, leaving their gaze free to wander the circle, checking in, adjusting tempo based on breathing they can hear but not see. You realize the music is not just accompaniment, it's calibration. Here's a quirky detail you might not expect. Traditional kora music often uses cyclical patterns rather than linear progressions. The melodies loop and evolve subtly, returning again and again with small variations. This makes it excellent for storytelling and, incidentally, for gently lulling people toward sleep without anyone admitting that's what's happening. You smile inwardly at the thought that centuries before playlists existed, someone already understood the power of repetition done kindly. The sound doesn't demand attention. It earns it by being consistent. Your thoughts slow, not because you're trying to relax, but because there's nowhere urgent for them to go. The music doesn't push forward, it circles. It revisits. It reminds you that not everything needs an ending to be complete. The griot hums quietly along with the strings, not forming words yet, just shaping breath into sound. This hum acts like a soft border around the music, keeping it contained, personal. You notice your own breathing begin to sync, a gentle, involuntary collaboration. No one instructed you to do this. Your body just joins in. Historians still wonder how much of oral history's endurance is owed to music itself. Was it the stories that survived because of melody, or the melodies that survived because they carried stories? Standing, or rather sitting here, the question feels less academic and more experiential. You can feel how sound holds memory differently than text ever could. It settles in places words alone don't reach. A small, almost mischievous flourish appears in the music, and the griot glances up, catching a few smiles around the fire. It's a musical wink, a reminder that even in reverence, there's room for play. This is not a solemn recital. It's a living exchange. The firelight flickers in time with the rhythm, or maybe the rhythm adjusts to the fire, you're not entirely sure. Either way, the effect is hypnotic. Shadows stretch and shrink, faces soften, and the night seems to lean closer, curious but respectful. You have the odd sensation that the music is not just being played, but listened to by everything around you. You shift your weight slightly, and the earth responds with cool patience. Somewhere nearby, a baby sighs in sleep, unbothered by history unfolding inches away. That feels right. These stories are meant to coexist with life, not interrupt it. The griot begins to weave words into the music, now slowly. letting syllables ride the notes instead of sitting on top of them. The language flows even if you don't understand every word. Meaning arrives through tone, pacing, and repetition. You realize comprehension here is not binary. You don't need to grasp everything to be carried along. Another accepted fact drifts in gently. Griot performances were often interactive, with listeners responding through murmurs, affirmations, or brief refrains. Tonight, the responses are minimal soft hums, nods, the occasional quiet It's enough. Participation doesn't have to be loud to be sincere. The griot pauses mid-phrase, letting the last note hang just long enough to feel its absence. The silence that follows is warm, not empty. It feels like the space between waves, necessary and expected. You notice how no one rushes to fill it. Silence, like music, has a role. A light joke slips in next. Something about a long-ago ancestor who sang beautifully but couldn't keep a goat alive for more than a week. Laughter ripples again, brief and affectionate. The humor grounds the history, reminding everyone that greatness and ordinary clumsiness often share the same family tree. You catch yourself smiling more openly now. Your face feels looser, less guarded. It's surprising how quickly that happens when no one is trying to sell you anything, not even a moral. The stories will come, you sense, but they won't lecture. They'll meander, revisit, and trust you to notice what matters. The music continues, steady and patient. You realize you've stopped wondering what comes next. Curiosity has softened into acceptance. Whatever arrives will arrive at the right pace. Your only task is to stay. The griot's fingers move with quiet confidence, and you understand that this sound has crossed generations, survived empires, outlasted borders. It has adapted without disappearing. That realization doesn't feel heavy. It feels reassuring. You sit there, breathing with the strings, letting the night hold you, aware that something subtle has already shifted. You are not just listening anymore. The music doesn't stop when the griot begins speaking more clearly. It simply steps back. Like a respectful companion making room, the strings soften into a steady undercurrent, and the voice rises just enough to carry meaning without disturbing the night. You feel the shift immediately. This is where names begin to appear. They arrive slowly, one after another, spoken with care, each name given the space it deserves. You notice how the griot doesn't rush through them, even though there are many. Especially because there are many. These are genealogies, and they are treated less like lists and more like rivers flowing, branching, occasionally looping back on themselves. You're guided along family lines that stretch farther than your sense of scale is comfortable with. Fathers and mothers, grandparents and cousins, alliances formed through marriage, rivalries softened by time. The griot traces them with the ease of someone describing a familiar path home. You, on the other hand, are doing mental gymnastics, just trying to keep up. It's humbling. Also mildly impressive in a way that makes your contact list feel deeply inadequate. This practice preserving genealogies orally is a widely accepted historical fact across many West African societies, particularly among Mand-speaking peoples. Lineage mattered not just for inheritance, but for identity, responsibility, and social balance. Knowing where you came from wasn't trivia. It was orientation. Here's a quirky detail that sneaks up on you. Genealogies weren't always strictly linear. They were flexible enough to include adoptive ties, symbolic kinship, and moments when someone's character mattered more than their bloodline. Memory here had room for nuance. You could belong because you behaved like you belonged, which feels surprisingly modern for something centuries old. The griot's voice dips and rises, occasionally pausing to let a name settle. You notice how the pauses change depending on the person mentioned. Some names get a longer silence, like a nod of respect. Others are followed by a soft chuckle, perhaps a gentle reminder that even notable ancestors were occasionally ridiculous. History, your learning, does not require perfection. As the genealogies unfold, you start to sense patterns. Certain names repeat, echoing across generations like familiar refrains. You realize this repetition isn't accidental, it's mnemonic. Repetition reinforces memory, anchors it. The same way a chorus makes a song easier to remember, these recurring names make history harder to lose. You feel yourself relaxing into the rhythm of it, no longer trying to map every connection. Instead, you let the sound wash over you, trusting that meaning doesn't always need to be passed to be absorbed. It's like listening to a language you don't speak fluently but still understand emotionally. The fire pops again, right on cue, and the griot smiles faintly. Timing like that could be coincidence, but it doesn't feel like one. The environment seems to collaborate with the story, offering punctuation where needed. You wonder briefly how many nights like this have unfolded under similar skies, with different listeners but the same names. Historians still wonder how genealogies remained so stable over time without written reinforcement. Some suggest that public performance acted as a form of peer review. If a griot made an error, someone in the audience would gently correct it. Others argue that the social consequences of misremembering were strong enough to ensure accuracy. Either way, it worked. Memory, when shared, polices itself. The griot leans slightly toward the fire as a particularly long lineage unfolds, as if warming both the story and themselves. You notice how their voice never strains, even when tracing centuries in a single breath. It's practiced, yes, but also patient. There's no sense of showing off. This is simply how things are done. A small joke slips in against something about an ancestor known for wisdom, who still managed to lose his sandals regularly. Laughter moves through the circle, soft and affectionate. The humor doesn't undermine the history, it humanizes it. You feel closer to these long-gone people now, not because they were great, but because they were recognizable. You begin to realize something quietly profound. Genealogies here are not about glorifying the past. They're about situating the present. Everyone listening knows exactly where they fit into this flow. You, as an outsider, feel that placement less clearly, but you can sense its importance. Knowing your place doesn't limit you. It steadies you. The griot's voice lowers slightly, and the music responds, dropping into a deeper register. The effect is grounding. You feel it in your chest, a gentle pressure that encourages stillness. Your breathing slows further, matching the cadence of names and notes. Another accepted fact floats into your awareness. Griots often served as living legal references. Land rights, marriage agreements, and political alliances were sometimes validated through remembered lineage. When memory holds contracts, accuracy becomes a communal priority. You suddenly understand why listening is treated with such seriousness. The genealogies begin to taper, not with a clear ending, but with a gradual narrowing. The griot brings the river closer to the present, names becoming fewer, more familiar to those around you. You sense recognition ripple through the circles, more nods, quiet murmurs. This is not abstract history, it's personal. You catch yourself wondering how different your relationship with the past might be if it were spoken to you like this. If your ancestors were described not as distant figures, but as characters whose habits and mistakes were remembered aloud, would you feel more connected, more accountable? Historians still debate whether oral genealogies shape behavior by reinforcing continuity or simply reflect it. The griot lets the last name fade into silence, allowing the music to carry the moment forward. No one claps. No one reacts loudly. The weight of what's been shared settles gently, like a blanket rather than a burden. You shift slightly, careful not to disturb the calm. The ground is cooler now, the night deeper, and you realize that without noticing exactly when it happened, you've stopped feeling like a visitor. You're part of the river now, floating, listening, carried along. The griot doesn't move straight on from names to events. That would be too abrupt, like skipping from introductions directly into arguments. Instead, the tone shifts gently, almost playfully, and you sense the next layer approaching before it arrives. This is where praise names come in, those carefully crafted phrases that follow a person through history like a well-earned nickname that refuses to fade. The griot leans forward slightly, voice lightening, and you hear the first one spoken aloud. It's descriptive, poetic, and just specific enough to make you smile. Praise names are a widely accepted feature of many West African oral traditions, functioning as condensed biographies. They tell you who someone was, what they did well, and occasionally what they did enthusiastically, but perhaps not wisely. You notice how the praise names are delivered with subtle shifts in tone. Some are spoken with reverence, others with warmth, and a few with what can only be described as affectionate restraint. The griot is careful here. Praise is not flattery. It's calibrated memory. Here's a lesser-known detail that quietly changes how you hear these names. Praise names were not always complimentary in the way you might expect. Some highlighted stubbornness, impatience, or overconfidence traits that shaped history as much as wisdom ever did. Remembering someone fully meant remembering their edges, which is refreshingly honest. A ruler is mentioned, followed by a praise name that translates loosely to something like he who built quickly and listened slowly. The circle responds with a low ripple of amusement. You imagine the man in question, grand in ambition, slightly allergic to advice. Suddenly, history feels very relatable. The griot pauses after each praise name, letting it land. These pauses are important. They give listeners time to visualize the person behind the words. You find yourself constructing mental images, clothing, posture, expressions, based solely on a few carefully chosen phrases. It's storytelling by suggestion, and it's remarkably effective. Another accepted fact drifts in. Praise names were often used in formal settings, including court ceremonies and negotiations. They could remind leaders of their responsibilities or gently caution them against repeating past mistakes. Imagine being introduced at an important meeting by your greatest strengths and most persistent flaws. Humbling, but efficient. The griot's humor surfaces again, this time a little sharper, though still kind. A story is told of a leader whose praise name referenced generosity so lavish it occasionally caused logistical problems. The punchline lands softly. Generosity is admirable, but someone still has to count the grain. Laughter follows, brief and knowing. Even virtue, it seems, benefits from moderation. You notice how the children in the circle listen closely during this part. Praise names are easier to remember than dates or sequences. They stick, they invite repetition. You can imagine a child trying one out later, testing its rhythm, earning a gentle correction if they get it wrong. Memory is trained early here, but never harshly. Historians still wonder how much these praise names influenced behavior. Did leaders live up to their praise, or were the names shaped after the fact to justify reputation? Perhaps both. The relationship between action and memory is rarely one-directional. Standing here, it feels more like a conversation across time. The griot's voice dips into a lower register as the stories grow more personal. Not every praise name belongs to a ruler. Some honor musicians, warriors, farmers, or advisors, people whose influence was quieter but no less important. You appreciate this balance. History is not presented as a parade of crowns. It's a network of contributions. A particularly tender praise name is offered for a woman remembered for counsel rather than command. The griot speaks it softly, and the circle responds with a respectful hush. You sense that this name carries weight, not because of spectacle, but because of steadiness. Wisdom, it seems, does not require volume. Here's another quirky detail. Praise names often evolved over time. New phrases could be added as reputations grew, while others faded if they no longer felt accurate. Memory here is not static. It breathes, it updates. You find that comforting. The past is allowed to change, not in fact, but in emphasis. The fire shifts again, sending sparks upward like brief exclamation points. The griot glances at them and smiles, as if acknowledging the punctuation. The music beneath the words adjusts slightly, keeping pace with the emotional tone. You're starting to notice how seamless this coordination is. Nothing feels rehearsed, yet everything feels intentional. You catch yourself wondering what your own praise name might be if someone were tasked with remembering you this way. The thought is both amusing and mildly alarming. They who tried their best but needed a nap comes to mind. You suppress a grin. The griot continues, weaving praise names into longer narratives now, showing how reputations intersected, clashed, and occasionally softened one another. A feud is mentioned, followed by praise names that hint at pride on both sides. The conflict resolves not with triumph, but with compromise. The lesson is subtle. No one spells it out. You're trusted to notice. Another accepted fact surfaces quietly. Griots often used praise poetry as a means of social regulation, reinforcing values without overt instruction. Praise what you want, repeated. Remember what you want, preserved. It's a gentle system, but a powerful one. The pace begins to slow again, the praise names tapering off like the end of a song's refrain. You feel the shift before you understand it. This section of memory has done its work. The circle seems a little more relaxed now, laughter having smoothed the edges of reverence. The griot leans back, letting the music fill the space once more. You realize how much has been conveyed without ever feeling heavy. History, when carried this way, doesn't press down, it settles in. You breathe out slowly, aware that something else is coming, but content to linger in this warmth a moment longer. The names, the humor, the humanity, they stay with you, not demanding attention, just quietly present. The laughter fades the way embers do not, abruptly, just gradually, until warmth remains without flame. The griot lets that softness settle before shifting again, and you sense movement without anyone standing up. The stories widen their lens, drifting away from individual lives and toward the spaces where those lives unfolded. Markets, paths, evenings like this one, only louder. You're guided gently into the idea of the market after dark. Not the daytime version, busy, transactional, practical, but the nighttime market, where urgency loosens its grip, and people linger for reasons that don't require receipts. In many West African towns and cities, markets were central to social life, a widely accepted historical fact that goes beyond buying and selling. They were places of exchange in every sense of the word. The griot describes the sounds first, because that's how memory works here. The soft rustle of cloth being folded, the knock of wooden bowls stacked together, voices overlapping without colliding. You can almost hear it now, layered and low, like a conversation that knows how to share space. You imagine walking through this market with the griot beside you, the fire replaced by oil lamps and moonlight. The ground is packed earth, cool underfoot. You pass baskets of kola nuts. their surfaces dull and textured, offered not just as food but as social glue. Kola nuts, historians agree, played an important role in hospitality and ritual across West Africa. Offering one was a gesture of welcome. Refusing one was complicated. Here's a quirky detail that feels very human. Nighttime markets were often where gossip traveled fastest. Not the sharp kind, but the slow, observational kind. Who married whom? Whose harvest surprised everyone? Who claimed they weren't tired but absolutely was? Information moved with the patience of someone enjoying the walk. The griot slips in a dry comment about how some people came to the market more for stories than for goods. A few quiet laughs ripple through the circle. You suspect everyone here knows at least one person like that. Possibly several. As the story unfolds, you notice how markets functioned as informal stages for griots themselves. They would perform snippet short praise lines, fragments of epics, playful verses to draw listeners in, not full performances. Just enough to remind people that memory was always nearby, available, woven into daily life. History didn't require a special event. It happened between transactions. You pause near a stall selling cloth in your imagination, patterns catching moonlight in soft flashes. The griot mentions how fabrics carried meaning, colors, designs, origins, each telling a story of trade routes and cultural exchange. The trans-Saharan trade networks, another accepted historical fact, connected West Africa to North Africa and beyond, moving goods, ideas, and styles across vast distances. You suddenly see the market not as local but as global in slow motion. Historians still wonder how much of this interconnectedness was understood by everyday people at the time. Did a buyer of cloth think about its journey across deserts and borders, or did they simply appreciate its feel and durability? Maybe understanding wasn't the point. Participation was enough. The griot's tone grows warmer as food enters the picture. Stews simmering late into the night. Grains roasted lightly for the next day. The smell alone, you're told, could keep people talking longer than planned. You smile at the familiar logic of hunger extending conversations. Some things never change. Another lesser-known detail surfaces. Markets were often where younger griots in training practiced their craft. They'd observe, memorize snippets, test their voices quietly, correcting themselves under their breath. Learning happened in the margins, not the spotlight. You imagine one of them now, standing just outside the circle of light, listening harder than anyone else. The griot's voice lowers again, and the music follows, shifting into a pattern that suggests movement without haste. You feel like you're strolling, not rushing. The night market is not about efficiency. It's about presence. A small joke lands about someone who claimed to be just passing through and was still there hours later. Deep in conversation, the circle chuckles. You think about how often you've done the same thing digitally, losing time without ever really being anywhere. This feels better. As the market scene fades, the griot gently draws you back, toward the fire, toward stillness. The transition is smooth, like turning down a path you didn't notice until you were already on it. You realize how seamlessly these stories move between motion and rest, public and private. Another accepted fact drifts in quietly. Griots adapted their performances to context. A market called for brevity and wit. An evening circle like this one invited depth and patience. Memory, it seems, is flexible when it needs to be. The firelight returns fully now, and you feel the ground beneath you again. The imagined sounds of the market linger just long enough to feel real before dissolving. You're left with a sense of connection not just to people, but to rhythms of life that valued unhurried exchange. You shift slightly, comfortable, grounded. The night has grown deeper, cooler. The griot pauses, letting the last echoes of the market settle. You can sense the next turn coming, but there's no urgency to reach it. For now, it's enough to know that history didn't only live in palaces or battles. Sometimes, it wandered the market after dark, listening. The market sounds fade completely now, replaced by the familiar hush of the circle and the steady companionship of the fire. You notice how icily your mind followed that shift, how willingly it returned. That's not an accident. Learning here is designed to feel like drifting, not grasping. The griot seems to sense this and leans into it. Voice settling into a rhythm that feels instructional without ever feeling like a lesson. This is where you begin to notice how listening itself is taught. The griot speaks about learning the way one might talk about whether something you experience rather than conquer. In many West African traditions, griots were trained from childhood through years of attentive listening, repetition, and correction. That's a widely accepted historical fact. And it means that memory here isn't treated as a talent you either have or don't. It's a skill you practice. Gently, daily, you imagine a younger version of the griot, sitting where you are now, eyes wide, body still, absorbing stories not with the intention of repeating them tomorrow, but someday. There's no rush in that approach. Knowledge is allowed to arrive slowly, to settle before it's ever asked to perform. Here's a lesser-known detail that feels surprisingly modern. Mistakes were considered part of training, not failures. A trainee griota might recite a passage incorrectly and be met not with scolding, but with patient repetition from an elder. Memory was shaped through kindness. You feel an unexpected relief at that. Somewhere in your own past, learning felt harsher than this. The griot demonstrates this process now, intentionally repeating a short phrase, altering it slightly, then returning it to its original form. You notice how the repetition draws your attention without demanding effort. By the third time, you could almost recite it yourself, not because you tried, but because your mind accepted the invitation. The music supports this quietly, looping beneath the words. You recognize the pattern from earlier, now understanding its purpose more clearly. Rhythm anchors memory. Melody smooths it. Together, they make forgetting inconvenient. Historians still wonder how oral traditions maintained such fidelity over centuries without external records. Some argue that communal correction acted as a safeguard. Others believe that the emotional weight attached to stories made them harder to distort. Sitting here, you suspect it's simpler than that. People remembered because they cared. The griot smiles faintly, as if acknowledging that thought, then adds a light joke about people who claim to listen but are actually planning their next meal. A few chuckles ripple through the circle. You feel mildly called out, even though you're not hungry. Probably, the teaching continues without being announced. The griot shifts posture slightly, signaling a change in tempo, and begins to recite a familiar lineage again, but slower this time. You notice how the pacing invites you to anticipate the next name. When it arrives, it feels satisfying, like finishing a sentence you didn't realize you knew. This technique-guided anticipation is another accepted element of griot training. Listeners learn by leaning forward mentally, by participating silently. You're not just absorbing information, you're rehearsing it internally. It's learning disguised as rest. The fire settles lower, its light softer now, shadows less dramatic. The night insects maintain their steady chorus, unconcerned with pedagogy. Everything feels aligned toward calm attention. Another quirky detail emerges. Some griots trained their memory by associating stories with physical movements or gestures. A hand motion for a river, a tilt of the head for a journey. You catch the griot doing this subtly now, fingers tracing shapes in the air. You wonder how much of the story lives, not just in sound, but in motion. You shift slightly, mirroring one of the gestures without realizing it. The movement feels natural, almost inevitable. Learning has slipped into your body. That's when you understand something important. This tradition doesn't separate mind and body. Memory is physical here. It lives in breath, posture, rhythm. The griot pauses, letting the last repetition settle. Silence stretches, comfortable and unforced. You notice how no one fills it. Everyone seems to understand that silence is part of the process. A space where memory organizes itself quietly. A question drifts through your mind, unprompted. Would this way of learning work everywhere, or does it rely on shared patience that modern life has misplaced? Historians still debate whether oral learning thrives best in tightly knit communities, or if it could survive broader, faster contexts. Sitting here, you suspect it could, but only if people agreed to slow down together. The griot resumes, voice softer now, almost conversational. They speak of responsibility not as burden, but as care. To remember something is to tend it, like a fire. Too much attention, and it flares. Too little, and it fades. The balance is learned over time. You feel your breathing deepen, slow, as if your body is practicing the same lesson. There's nothing to memorize right now, nothing to perform, just listening, just being present. The music fades to a simple pattern, nearly a hum. The griot's voice follows suit, lowering, easing. You sense that this part of the journey has done what it needed to do. You understand now how memory is built not through urgency, but through return. You sit quietly, feeling the weight of the day slip further away. The night feels thicker, softer, more forgiving. And somewhere between the fire's glow and the griot's steady presence, you realize that learning, at its gentlest, feels a lot like rest. The night leans a little closer now, the way it does when people stop shifting and start settling. You notice it first in the fire, which has decided it doesn't need to prove anything anymore. The flames are lower, steadier, glowing instead of reaching. The griot senses the change and adjusts without comment. Voice softening into a tone that feels more intimate, more deliberate. This is where the stories widen again. Not outward this time, but inward toward voices that history often keeps quieter. The griot begins to speak of women as memory keepers, and you notice the shift immediately. The cadence changes. Slower, warmer, less performance, more presence. In many West African societies, women played crucial roles in preserving oral traditions. A widely accepted historical fact that doesn't always receive the attention it deserves. They were storytellers, singers, advisors, and teachers, carrying history in forms that didn't always sit at the center of the fire but shaped everything around it. You imagine them, now women seated just beyond the brightest light. Voices low, steady, correcting details softly, reinforcing memory through daily repetition rather than formal performance. Not all memory needs an audience. Some of it lives best in kitchens, courtyards, and quiet conversations. Here's a lesser-known detail that shifts your perspective. In some traditions, female griots specialized in specific genres, wedding songs, lullabies, moral tales, forms of storytelling woven directly into life's transitions. These weren't secondary roles. They were foundational. If you wanted memory to survive, you embedded it in moments people never skipped. The griot tells of women who could recite lineages just as fluently as their male counterparts, but who chose different settings to do so. A naming ceremony, a funeral, a long walk to the river. Memory here adapted to context, and women ensured it followed people wherever they went. You feel a quiet respect settle over the circle. The tone is not reverent in a dramatic wits, steadier than that. Acknowledging what has always been there doesn't require applause. Just attention. The griot's voice carries a hint of dry humor again, as they mention how some women were known for correcting stories. Mid-performance, politely but firmly. A name mispronounced. A date slightly off. The correction delivered with a smile that left no room for argument. Laughter flickers softly around you. Authority, it seems, does not always announce itself. Historians still wonder how much of oral history survived precisely because it was distributed across genders and spaces. Was memory stronger because it wasn't centralized? Because it lived in both formal and informal settings? Sitting here, it feels likely. Redundancy, after all, is a form of care. The griot hums briefly, a tune that feels like it could double as a lullaby. You realize that many of the first stories people heard were sung by women, woven into sleep, repetition smoothing meaning into something that felt safe. Memory, introduced gently, is harder to forget. The fire crackles softly, almost in agreement. You notice how your own posture has softened, shoulders heavy in the best way. This section of the story doesn't ask for alertness. It asks for trust. Another accepted fact drifts in quietly. Women often acted as custodians of proverbs. Those short, memorable phrases that carry generations of observation in a single breath. Proverbs are efficient. They travel well. You imagine one being whispered now, passed from mouth to ear, slipping easily into thought. A playful moment surfaces as the griot recounts a proverb that gently mocks impatience. The circle responds with knowing smiles. You feel seen. The lesson lands without landing hard. That's the artistry. You find yourself wondering how many stories you know that came from someone whose name you never learned. How much of what you carry was shaped by voices history didn't label prominently. Historians still debate how to measure influence in oral cultures whose voices shaped outcomes most and whose contributions remain unnamed. Here, the answer feels less urgent than the acknowledgement. The griot lets the music return briefly, a simple pattern that feels like breathing. You match it without thinking, inhaling and exhaling in time. The night air is cooler now, wrapping around you like a shawl. This part of the journey feels quieter, but not smaller. If anything, it feels expansive in a different direction, deep rather than wide. You sense that memory, when held this way, becomes resilient not through spectacle, but through care. The griot's voice fades slightly, allowing the circle's shared stillness to take over. No one moves, no one rushes. The stories of women as memory keepers settle gently among you, not demanding recognition, simply existing as they always have. You sit there, breathing slowly, aware that history has just leaned closer and whispered something important without raising its voice. The night feels fuller now, not louder, just more complete. The fire has settled into a steady glow, and the circle around it seems smaller. Not because anyone moved, but because attention has drawn inward. The griot senses this compression and gently expands the story outward again, stretching it across geography and time without breaking the calm. This is where empires drift into view, not with banners or trumpets, but like landmarks appearing in low light, recognizable, steady, and already half-known. The griot speaks of Mali and Songhai, names that carry weight without needing emphasis. These were powerful states in West Africa between roughly the 13th and 16th centuries, a widely accepted historical fact. Known for trade, scholarship, and administrative sophistication. You don't feel lectured. You feel oriented. The griot doesn't list dates. They don't need to. Instead, they describe textures, the steady movement of caravans, the measured authority of courts, the quiet confidence of cities that knew who they were. You picture Timbuktu not as a myth, but as a place with dust on its streets and books in its rooms. which, historically speaking, it was. Here's a lesser-known detail that feels almost mischievous. Many griots remembered empires not by their expansion, but by their habits. How leaders listened, how disputes were settled, how guests were treated. Power, in this telling, is measured less by territory and more by temperament. The griot describes a ruler whose greatness was remembered for patience rather than conquest. The praise name attached to him emphasizes balance, not dominance. You find that refreshing. History often celebrates noise. This version respects steadiness. As the story flows, you notice how the griot avoids sharp rises in tension. Even moments of political change are smoothed by context and consequence. A leader dies, another rises. The emphasis is not on drama, but on continuity. Life goes on. Memory adjusts. Another accepted fact surfaces gently. Griots often served as advisors in royal courts, using historical precedent to guide decisions. Their role wasn't to flatter, but to remind you. Imagine standing before a ruler and being calmly told how a similar decision worked out 3 generations ago. That's not criticism. That's perspective. Historians still wonder how much influence griots truly wielded in moments of power. Were they quiet observers or active shapers of policy? The truth likely varies. Sitting here, it feels safe to assume they mattered not by force, but by presence. The griot's voice dips as the empires reach their peaks, then lowers further as decline arrives, not with collapse, but with soft inevitability. Trade routes shift, alliances change. Nothing is framed as failure, just change. You appreciate that. It makes the past feel less judgmental. A small, dry joke surfaces about how even great empires struggled with logistics. Grain still had to be counted. Messengers still got tired. The circle responds with gentle laughter. Power, it seems, does not exempt anyone from practical realities. The music beneath the words takes on a slightly deeper tone, grounding the narrative. You feel it in your chest again, steady and reassuring. The night insects continue their chorus, indifferent to empire, loyal only to rhythm. You begin to notice how these stories of Mali and Songhai don't feel distant. They feel adjacent. Like neighboring rooms in a large house you're slowly exploring, the griot doesn't romanticize. They normalize. Empires were part of life, not the point of it. You wonder, briefly, how different global history might feel if more of it were told this way, less as a sequence of rises and falls, more as a pattern of adjustments. Historians still debate whether oral traditions emphasize continuity over disruption, and if so, why? Sitting here, the answer feels simple. Continuity is comforting. The griot allows the empires to recede naturally, not concluding them, just letting them fade into the background of memory where they belong. The fire glows steadily. The circle breathes together. You realize you're not tired in the way that begs for sleep. You're tired in the way that welcomes it. And the night, patient as ever, continues. The empires drift back into the dark without ceremony, like guests who know when to leave. What remains is the circle, the fire, and the griot's quiet awareness of the room. You feel a subtle lift in the atmosphere, not excitement, but lightness. This is where humor finds its way back in, not as interruption, but as seasoning. The griot smiles before you realize why, and then you hear it, a joke folded neatly between verses. It arrives casually, slipped into a heroic tale, almost sideways. A great leader is praised, their wisdom established, their patience admired, and then, without changing tone, the griot mentions the leader's legendary inability to wake up early. The circle responds immediately, laughter low and affectionate. Even the fire seems to flicker brighter, as if enjoying the moment. Humor in griot performances is a widely accepted historical feature, not an accident or a modern addition. Jokes were used to keep audiences engaged during long recitations and, more importantly, to humanize history. Greatness, after all, is easier to carry when it's allowed to sit next to ordinary flaws. You notice how carefully the humor is placed. It never undermines the story, it supports it. The griot knows exactly how far to lean into the joke before pulling back. This isn't comedy for applause. It's humor for balance. Here's a lesser-known detail that makes you smile. Griots sometimes used humor strategically to critique authority. A joke about a past ruler's stubbornness could serve as a gentle reminder to a present one. Everyone laughed, and everyone understood. The message landed without confrontation. You think about how rare that skill feels now. The griot continues, weaving another light moment into a tale of travel, mentioning a messenger so fast he arrived early and had to wait awkwardly. The image is vivid and oddly relatable. You imagine the poor man standing there, shifting his weight, wondering if he should leave and come back. History, it turns out, had its share of social discomfort. The circle relaxes further. You feel it in your shoulders, in the way people sit a little more loosely now. Humor has done its quiet work, dissolving any lingering tension. You're reminded that laughter doesn't wake you up here. It settles you in. Historians still wonder how much of this humor was spontaneous, and how much was preserved alongside the stories themselves. Were these jokes repeated word for word across generations, or did each griot add their own flavor? Sitting here, you suspect it's both. Memory leaves room for personality. The music underneath shifts into a slightly quicker pattern, not energetic, just playful. You tap a finger against your leg without realizing it. The rhythm invites movement, but not enough to pull you out of rest. It's the musical equivalent of a raised eyebrow. Another accepted fact surfaces gently. Griots were expected to read the room. Their performances changed based on audience, time of night, and mood. Tonight, the humor feels perfectly timed, arriving, just as attention might drift, then easing away before overstaying its welcome. The griot tells a brief anecdote about a feast remembered less for its grandeur and more for the moment when the drums stopped because everyone was too full to clap properly. The circle laughs again, quieter this time, smiles lingering. You can almost hear the awkward silence that must have followed. You notice how the humor creates connection across generations. These moments feel timeless because they are. People have always laughed at the same things: overconfidence, hunger, fatigue, small social missteps. The past feels closer when it shares your sense of irony. As the laughter fades, the griot lets the silence stretch again, trusting it to hold. No one rushes. No one fills the gap. You appreciate how silence here isn't treated as absence, but as space. You feel your breathing deepen. Your thoughts soften. The humor hasn't energized you, it's grounded you. It's reminded you that history is not a pedestal, it's a place people lived. The griot's smile lingers just a moment longer before their expression settles back into calm focus. You sense the turn coming, the stories will slow again soon, drifting toward quieter ground. But for now, the warmth of shared amusement hangs in the air, gentle and reassuring. You sit there, comfortable, aware that even in the deepest telling of memory, there has always been room for a soft laugh by the fire. The laughter thins out naturally, like ripples smoothing back into still water. The griot doesn't rush to replace it. They let the quiet do its work, trusting that everyone can feel the shift coming. You sense it, too, a subtle tightening of focus, not uncomfortable, just attentive. This is where the night carries in something new. The tone grows thoughtful, not heavy, but deliberate. The griot begins to speak of change that arrived without asking permission. Colonial encounters, they explain, did not come crashing in all at once. They crept, they arrived through trade agreements, new languages, unfamiliar paperwork. This is a widely accepted historical fact. Written records and foreign administrative systems began to intersect with oral traditions across West Africa in uneven, complicated ways. Nothing simply replaced anything. Things overlapped, collided, adapted. You imagine the first time a written document was presented as proof, its authority assumed rather than negotiated. The griot describes it gently, without resentment or drama. More like a curiosity that slowly became a habit. Words fixed on paper began to compete with words carried in memory. Here's a lesser-known detail that feels quietly important. Many griots learned to read and write, integrating written records into their oral practice rather than abandoning tradition. Memory didn't retreat, it adjusted. Stories expanded to include new tools, new references, new constraints. The griot speaks of this period not as loss, but as tension. Oral historians continued to recite genealogies and epics, but now alongside documents that claimed permanence. You sense the unspoken question in the air. Which one listens better? Historians still wonder how much knowledge was altered during this transition. Not erased, but did the presence of writing freeze stories that once flowed? Or did it preserve details that might otherwise have faded? Sitting here, the answer feels unresolved, and that feels honest. The griot offers a small, dry observation about how paper forgets tone. The circle responds with soft murmurs of agreement. You smile, you've read things that would have sounded kinder out loud. The music beneath the words becomes simpler now, almost sparse. The kora doesn't disappear. It steps back, letting space speak. You feel the weight of the moment without it pressing down. This is reflection, not lament. Another accepted fact surfaces quietly. Colonial administrations often undervalued oral historians, dismissing their knowledge as informal or unreliable. Yet those same administrations relied on local expertise to function. The contradiction hangs gently in the air, not called out, just acknowledged. The griot recounts a moment when a story survived precisely because it was not written down, kept alive in performance, when documents were lost, damaged, or ignored. The irony lands softly. Memory, it seems, has its own durability. A subtle joke slips in, something about ink running in the rain while voices carried on. You exhale through a smile. Even here, humor finds a way to steady the balance. You feel your body relax again as the tension dissolves into acceptance. This part of the journey doesn't ask you to judge. It asks you to notice. Change happens. Memory adapts. The night continues. The griot lets the story rest there, not concluding it, just setting it down gently. The fire glows low and constant. The insects keep time. And you sit with the understanding that history doesn't disappear when challenged, it learns how to breathe differently. The pause after those thoughts feels intentional. Like the griot has placed a bowl down between you and invited you to look inside it without touching. The fire settles into a patient glow, and somewhere beyond the circle a night bird asks a question no one answers. You stay very still, because stillness seems to be the correct response. Now the griot leans slightly forward, not dramatically, just enough to signal curiosity rather than authority. This is where certainty loosens its grip. They speak about accuracy, a word that sounds simple until you try to hold it. In oral tradition, accuracy does not always mean repetition word for word. This is a widely accepted historical understanding. Griots are trained to preserve core truths, lineage, events, relationships, even as phrasing, imagery, or emphasis subtly shift with context and audience. The skeleton remains. The posture changes. You imagine a story stretching like a cat in the sun. Always the same creature, never quite the same pose. The griot asks a question aloud. One historians still wonder about. When a story changes slightly to remain meaningful, is it becoming less accurate or more honest? No one answers, because no one needs to. The question is meant to sit with you, not solve itself. A lesser-known detail slips in gently. Some griot lineages maintained internal correction rituals, where elders quietly adjusted younger storytellers after performances, not to punish, but to recalibrate. Accuracy here was communal, negotiated softly, like tuning instruments before a song, rather than stopping the music mid. You feel strangely comforted by that. The idea that truth can be maintained without rigidity feels like a warm blanket, laid just so. The griot continues, explaining how European historians once struggled to accept oral accounts as reliable sources. Dates were flexible. Characters occasionally merged. Metaphors carried weight equal to facts. To written traditions, this felt unsettling. To oral cultures, it felt normal. You think about how even written histories revise themselves constantly, just with better lighting and footnotes. A quiet joke floats through the circle about how books argue with each other in libraries, while storytellers argue face to face, at least offering tea afterward. You smile again. Humor, it seems, is another method of preservation. The kora returns with a slow, looping phrase, almost hypnotic now. You notice your breathing syncing with it without effort. This is not information being delivered. It's understanding being paced. Another accepted fact surfaces. Many modern historians now actively collaborate with griots, recognizing oral histories as essential sources rather than supplements. Memory is no longer treated as fragile. It is treated as skilled. Still, debates remain. The griot does not hide this. They speak openly about disagreements, about timelines, about whether certain figures were symbolic or literal, about whether some epics describe single rulers or composite memories. You sense no defensiveness, only curiosity. Debate here is not conflict. It is care. You're invited, quietly, into that space of wondering. You imagine stories as rivers again, sometimes splitting, sometimes rejoining, always moving forward. Accuracy, in this image, is not a fixed point, but a direction. The fire crackles softly, as if agreeing. Or maybe it's just wood being wood. The griot would probably say both are true. Another small, almost whispered detail appears. Some griots deliberately leave minor ambiguities unresolved, believing that future generations should have room to interpret rather than inherit conclusions. That thought settles deep. History as an open hand, not a closed fist. You feel the night deepen. The stars seem closer now, though that might just be your eyes adjusting. The conversation slows, not because it's finished, but because it has reached a comfortable pace. No one here is rushing towards certainty. The griot's voice lowers slightly, inviting calm rather than attention. You realize that accuracy, in this setting, is less about exactness and more about responsibility to remember carefully, to adapt respectfully, and to leave space for those who come next. Your body sinks further into rest as these thoughts drift around you. They don't demand engagement. They simply exist, like the hum of insects or the warmth of the fire on your shins. And as the music softens again, you sense the journey moving forward, carrying these questions with it, unburdened by the need for final answers. The night has matured now. Not late, exactly, just comfortably deep, like a conversation that has found its rhythm and no longer needs to prove anything. The fire burns lower, but steadier, and you notice how the circle leans inward without anyone saying so. This is where the story quietly catches up to you. The griot's voice carries a gentle note of continuity, as if to reassure you that nothing you've heard belongs only to the past. Memory, after all, dislikes being retired. They begin speaking about modern griots, and you might be surprised how ordinary that word suddenly feels. This is a widely accepted fact. Griots still exist today across West Africa and the diaspora, adapting their roles to radios, recordings, classrooms, festivals, and living rooms. The function remains, even when the setting changes. You picture a radio humming softly in a village at dusk, a familiar voice threading history between weather updates and music, or a classroom where students learn lineage alongside spelling. The griot smiles slightly, as if they know exactly which image landed for you. Here's a lesser-known detail that feels quietly delightful. Some modern griots consciously adjust their pacing and tone for recorded formats, slowing their delivery because microphones, unlike people, never blink or breathe. Storytelling, it turns out, listens to its audience even when the audience is invisible. The kora shifts again, introducing a pattern that feels almost contemporary, though nothing about it breaks tradition. You realize that adaptation doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just happens naturally, like adding a cushion to an old chair instead of replacing it. The griot speaks of cassette tapes passed hand to hand in the late 20th century, preserving epics that once lived only in evening air. Later, digital recordings followed. Phones entered the picture. Memory learned new pockets to sit in. You think about how strange it is that a device designed for calls now also carries centuries. Historians still wonder whether recording oral performances freezes them too much, turning living stories into museum pieces. Or does it simply create another layer of memory, one that can be returned to, argued with, reinterpreted? The griot doesn't answer. They shrugged lightly, a physical punctuation mark. A small joke slips in about how ancestors probably never expected to be streamed, but would likely approve of the reach. The circle releases a soft ripple of laughter, careful not to disturb the calm. You feel it in your chest more than you hear it. Another accepted truth settles in. Modern griots often take on roles as cultural educators, mediators, and public historians, bridging generational gaps. They are not frozen in time. They are busy, you imagine, one checking notes before a performance, maybe sipping tea, maybe adjusting a microphone stand with the same care once given to tuning strings. The griot nearby mentions diaspora communities, where oral traditions help stitch identity across oceans and centuries. Songs remember villages long left behind. Names survive geography. You sense how memory becomes both anchor and sail. There's a moment where the music fades almost entirely, leaving just the voice. You realize how used you've become to its presence. Silence now feels like punctuation rather than absence. Another lesser-known detail emerges gently. Some griots collaborate with hip-hop artists, poets, and filmmakers, weaving ancient forms into modern expressions. The griot raises an eyebrow playfully, as if daring tradition to complain. Tradition, apparently, does not. You feel a quiet reassurance settle over you. The past is not fragile. It doesn't shatter when touched by the present. It stretches, it breathes. It finds new ways to sit beside you. Your body feels heavy in the best possible way. The air is cooler now. The insects have adjusted their rhythm again. Slower, more spaced out. Everything seems to be preparing for rest, not ending. As the griot's voice softens further, you sense the journey beginning its descent toward closure, not a stop, just a gentler slope. You carry with you the understanding that memory doesn't need protecting from time. It just needs listening. The night feels thinner now, like a veil rather than a curtain. You notice it in small ways. The fire no longer crackles as often. The air cools against your arms, and the circle has loosened without anyone standing up. No one is leaving. Exactly, they're simply settling. The griot's voice drifts lower, almost conversational, as if they're speaking more to the fire than to you. This is the hour when stories begin to slow themselves, when even memory seems to yawn politely. They speak about endings that aren't really endings. This is a widely accepted truth in oral tradition. Performances often taper gently, allowing listeners to carry unfinished echoes with them rather than delivering sharp conclusions. A story that ends too cleanly, the griot suggests, doesn't travel well into sleep. You feel that immediately. Your thoughts are already softening around the edges. The music mirrors this shift. The kora plays fewer notes now, each one spaced carefully, like stepping stones across shallow water. You notice how much space there is between sounds, and how comforting that space feels. Silence here isn't empty. It's padded. A lesser-known detail floats into the moment. Griots traditionally gauge when to wind down, not by time, but by breath, watching the audience's shoulders drop. Their blinking slow, their posture soften. You smile faintly. Apparently, you're part of the signal now. The griot teases the fire gently, joking that it too knows when it's time to behave. A few embers glow in agreement. You let out a quiet breath through your nose. Even jokes are quieter now. The conversation turns toward night itself. The griot describes how evening gatherings historically served as safe containers for memory darkness, discouraging distractions, encouraging attention. This is a well-established historical observation. Without artificial lighting, night naturally gathered people together, making storytelling both practical and intimate. You imagine this same scene centuries ago, the same posture, the same firelight reflecting in eyes heavy with day's labor. The thought doesn't excite you. It soothes you. Historians still wonder whether the effectiveness of oral storytelling is tied more to content or to timing. These same stories hold the same power at noon, under harsh sun. The griot seems to think not. Some truths, they suggest, prefer dim lighting. The insects have slowed again, their sounds stretching farther apart. The fire sighs softly. Someone nearby shifts, the fabric of their clothing whispering like punctuation at the end of a sentence. Another gentle, almost hidden detail appears. Some griots intentionally lowered their pitch and volume at the end of long sessions, encouraging listeners to drift without realizing it. You feel mildly amused to realize this might be happening to you right now. Your breathing has become deeper, slower. You no longer feel like you're listening so much as floating near the sound. The words don't demand understanding anymore. They simply pass through. The griot recounts a final image, embers carried forward to relight tomorrow's fire, never allowed to die completely. Memory, they imply, works the same way. It dims, it rests, it waits. No dramatic closing follows. No applause. Just a long, shared quiet. You realize this is the point. Stories, like nights, don't need punctuation. They need permission to fade. Your body sinks further into comfort as the circle holds still, letting the fire do what fires eventually do. And you feel yourself doing the same, lowing, settling, trusting that nothing important will be lost if you don't notice the moment you decide to leave. It happens quietly, like a story concluding itself while you're still enjoying the sound of it. The circle remains, the fire remains. But something in you has already stood up gently and brushed the dust from borrowed time. The griot speaks again, softly, not to hold you, but to send you off properly. This is a widely accepted truth in griot tradition. Stories are not owned by the teller or the listener. They are carried temporarily and then passed along. You were never meant to stay forever. You were meant to leave with something. The last words aren't instructions or morals. They're more like reminders. Names you won't fully remember. Images that blur pleasantly at the edges. A rhythm that settles somewhere behind your ribs. Memory, the griot suggests, doesn't need to be precise to be useful. It needs to be felt. You imagine walking away from the fire, the light thinning behind you, the sound of the kora fading into night air. The path ahead isn't dark in a threatening way. It's dark in a familiar way, like a hallway in your own home after midnight. You know where you're going without seeing it clearly. Here's a quieter, lesser-known detail. Traditionally, listeners were expected to reflect privately on stories rather than discuss them immediately. Meaning settles better in silence. You appreciate that. You've had enough words for now. The griot offers one last, very dry comment about how memory gets heavier the more you try to pack it neatly. Best to carry it loosely, they say. You smile at that, even as your thoughts slow. Historians still wonder how much oral tradition shapes identity long after specific details are forgotten. Do we remember events, or do we remember how it felt to be part of something shared? As you walk, that question doesn't feel urgent. It feels gentle. The fire is smaller now, but still alive. That image stays with you. Embers don't rush. They don't panic about the dark. They simply continue being warm. You step farther away, but the night doesn't close behind you. It opens. The sounds of insects, distant movement, your own breathing, all of it blends into a steady, unremarkable peace. This, too, is part of the story. You carry the song home without trying to memorize it. It hums quietly on its own. And as your body settles fully into rest, you understand that remembering doesn't always require effort. Sometimes it just requires sleep. The journey doesn't end abruptly. It softens. Your breathing slows naturally now, longer exhales than inhales, like the night itself is breathing with you. You don't need to hold on to images or names anymore. Let them drift, like smoke thinning into the dark, leaving warmth behind without leaving a mess. Imagine the fire one last time. Not bright, not loud, just steady. The embers glow patiently, knowing morning will come whether they watch for it or not. You don't need to watch either. You've done enough listening for one night. Your body grows heavier, comfortably so, like settling into a familiar place you've returned to many times before. The world feels quieter, not empty, just hushed in a friendly way. Nothing is asking anything from you now. If thoughts wander, let them. If they slow, let them. There's no wrong way to drift here. The story has already given you what it needed to give. You are safe. You are allowed to rest. Memory will take care of itself. Let the darkness be soft. Let the silence be kind. Let sleep arrive whenever it's ready.